Today we're going to talk about Ford and Carter. So if you remember, and those of you, make sure you're paying attention because we are going to start through these. Like I said, it's not going to take too long, so just give me your time for a little bit. We're going to talk about Ford and Carter. We'll start off by, if we remember last class, if we look through a lot of this stuff, we dealt with Nixon. We dealt with what was going on during Nixon's presidency. Obviously, one of the big things was Watergate, right? Well, this isn't working though. Now my computer's frozen. That's great. Here we go. Okay, so we talked about Nixon. We talked about Watergate, his famous kind of peace out from office. And it's important to think of those things again, because as Ford takes over, a lot of the issues and a lot of the repercussions that you would think, would probably follow Nixon, instead of following Nixon, he's out of office and the guy that's taking over is Ford. So a lot of that stuff actually kind of leaches onto his presidency. With the Watergate legacy, what we're seeing here is that Nixon is obviously damaging the reputation of his presidency, but also not just his presidency, the presidency in general. People are now pretty wary about politics. People are weary about, can you trust the government? People are like, well, can you trust the president? And it's not just Nixon. If you remember, Spiro Agnew has his own corruption scandals as well. So you have the vice president resigning for corruption scandals, and then you have the president in the same administration resigning for one of the biggest corruption scandals in U.S. history. We had the Watergate affair, again, which, in taking some positivity from it, of all the things that have happened in the U.S., especially during the 60s and then moving on to the 70s, this proves that the country can weather such a crisis. Just like the country can build back and take back over some of our power after a crisis such as a presidential assassination and then a further assassination of the president's relative, and then our other large assassinations that are happening during the time of MLK. There's an additional thing here that we are weathering. We're getting through. We're moving on, hopefully, from the Watergate affair, and hopefully the country can continue to build. Especially because, if you remember, there's a lot of kind of economic issues during this time. And then with Nixon's resignation, when it happens, people are like, hey, this is a triumph of the system. Nixon resigned. If he didn't, he was going to be removed forcefully, pretty much. And because that happened, people are like, well, maybe we can trust this. Something bad happened, but at least the right thing was done. But as you'll see, when Ford comes in, that kind of perception of the whole situation is going to change as well. So right now we're looking at the Ford and Carter years, two vastly different presidents here. With Ford, he's got a kind of interesting life. He was a football player at the University of Michigan. He was a U.S. Navy member. He fought in World War II, did an extensive stay in Congress. And, addition to all this stuff, he was the first person to not be elected to either president or vice president and become the president. So through that presidential succession chain, usually when this situation happens, with Kennedy, when Lyndon Johnson came over, he was already the vice president, right? Ford goes in to become the vice president after Spiro Agnew is resigning, and then Nixon resigns, and then Ford's like, whoa, I am the president of the United States, right? So making history there. But the big thing here is to remember that Watergate still does scar the public's faith in the government, and Ford is part of that government, and now he's in the highest position in that government. Ford, this is the thing that he does that really kind of carries this on. Now, Ford makes an argument. We talked about Ford pardoning Nixon last class, but he makes an argument, much like what I think we're kind of seeing as a discourse in the United States today, is that he wants the nation to heal, right? And that's something that we're still seeing, again, talked about to this day, different kind of political discourse. Ford is kind of bringing up the same argument. He's saying that he doesn't want to go after Nixon. He wants to move on from Watergate, and it's time for a change in leadership, right? Additionally, he selects Nelson Rockefeller as his VP, former governor of New York. Not the most popular choice among Congress, not the most popular choice among the population, but that is obviously the least of Ford's issues during this time. When he pardons Nixon, he officially forgives Nixon of any crimes he may have committed, and this causes Ford's popularity to pretty much plummet. There's also the talk about, is Ford directly tied to Nixon? Was there some sort of quid pro quo? This is something that's thrown in Ford's face a lot. Ford, why did you pardon the president? It looks a little weird, right? You have been given basically the office. Was that in exchange for something? Was that in exchange for a pardon? And that is something that a lot of people talk about. It's not like that's been like clarified or even, dove into too, gigantically. But Ford does kind of testify and explain his reasoning to a board of people and explain why he pardoned Nixon. Regardless, even with his explanations, a lot of people are looking at this and they're like, oh my gosh, right? And Watergate is continuing to tarnish another presidency. This is not everything that Ford's presidency is about, and we'll get to Carter in a second. But Ford's presidency, it's not just Watergate, though similar to Nixon, a lot of that stuff does overshadow what's going on there. Ford is establishing policies in his first year, despite opposition from a heavily Democratic Congress. So in the Republican Party, he's kind of dealing with some opposition. His first his first issue was inflation, right? That's what he wants to curb, if you remember. Economy's not great under Nixon either, and it's not like it's a magically fixed when Ford takes over. Tries to curb inflation, starts to make some progress there, but then we have an issue with the recession. That becomes the more serious domestic problem. He shifts his aims to that, to stimulate the economy, but Ford's like deathly afraid of inflation. He has so many different things that he tries to do with it. In fact, during his first 14 months as president, he vetoed 39 measures, which would maybe add to some sort of heavy budgetary deficit. Ford continued to hold himself as a moderate in domestic affairs, a conservative in fiscal affairs, and a dyed-in-the-wool internationalist in foreign affairs. Major goal was to help businesses operate more freely by reducing taxes upon it and easing controls exercised by regulatory agencies. Ford is famous for saying, we declared our independence 200 years ago, and we are not about to lose it now to paper shufflers and computers. In foreign affairs, Ford acted vigorously to maintain U.S. power and prestige after the collapse of Cambodia and South Vietnam. Preventing a new war in the Middle East remained a major objective by providing aid to both Israel and Egypt. The Ford administration helped persuade the two countries to accept interim truce agreements. Alongside all this stuff, there's still a detente, which is basically this easing hostile relationship with the Soviet Union. Cold War's still not over, which is a big thing that everybody always forgets during this time. Something that rages on until like the 90s. Really kind of crazy. Though it's taking a backseat to what it usually was. Okay. President Ford and the Soviet leaders set new limitations upon nuclear weapons as well. So like I said, it's not like Ford's entire presidency. I don't want to gloss over some of the things that he did or some of the mistakes that he made as well. It's not all about Watergate, but it definitely is a huge kind of a role to play on his legacy as well. Next, we have Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter is this, it reminds me of some of the stuff that we've viewed recently, where a Washington outsider becomes president. Somebody who doesn't have a lot of ties to D.C., somebody who not a lot of Americans really know of. He is elected in 1976 by a slim popular majority. His election is probably the result of turmoil in the 60s, a lot of crazy stuff going on. Watergate, obviously, is a huge deal, kind of a stain on the Republican Party, conservatives in that area, because Nixon's ties to that party as well. And still, this idea of a fresh face, okay? The fresh face in Washington, somebody that's going to come in and be for the people, by the people, right? And that's what Carter uses he uses it to his advantage. He wants to portray himself as a man of the people. He dresses informally. He adopts like this folksy speaking style. He introduces actually a number of ambitious programs for social and economic reform and included a relatively large number of women and minorities in his cabinet, especially for the time. However, despite Democratic majorities in the House and the Senate, Congress blocked Carter's proposal for welfare reform, as well as his proposal for a long-range energy program, a central focus of his administration. And that whole idea with the energy program is going to come back into play. This difficult relationship with Congress meant that Carter was unable to convert his plans into legislation, despite his initial popularity. And he was initially popular. When Carter came in, a lot of people were like, hey, who's this guy? Fresh face, sounds good, man of the people, bless you. Dresses super nice, super informal, right? He just walks around and he does all the things that you and I do. And people are like, wow, I can relate to this. He does things like hold town meetings. He didn't have a lot of ties to Congress, as I said, but one of the biggest things that happens here is Carter is seen as this this guy who doesn't have a lot of experience. He, by some standards, is unable to adjust to D.C. and governing life as president. As the 39th president of the United States, Jimmy Carter struggled to respond to formidable challenges, including the major energy crisis, as well as high inflation and unemployment. Like I said, those things didn't go away under Nixon. They don't go away under Ford. And, now Carter is here to deal with them as well. He reopened U.S. relations with China and made efforts to broker peace in the historic Arab-Israeli conflict, but was damaged late in his term by a hostage crisis in Iran. And we may watch a movie about that in the next couple of weeks. Though he claimed an increase of 8 million jobs and a reduction in the budget deficit by the end of his term, many business leaders as well as the public blamed Carter for the nation's continuing struggles, saying he didn't have a coherent or effective policy to address them. What's happening here is basically people are like, hey, an outsider, somebody who's got a lot of ties to Washington, maybe somebody with a little bit less experience with all this stuff. But then as he settles into the presidency, people use that less as like a, hey, let's bring him in, and more of like a, hey, how can we pick apart all the stuff that he's doing? And how can we tie that back to maybe some faults in his policies as well? Carter also grants amnesty to those who evaded the draft, which is basically this political pardon. Won't dive into that too much because I know that we talked about it a little bit before. But those of you during the time, if you were like somebody who draft dodged and you're getting charged with a crime, no longer is that something that you have to worry about. Again, this idea of maybe moving on, right? Another big thing that Carter's dealing with during the time is the oil crisis, or also, just an energy crisis in general. There's a lot of problems involving energy, involving oil that are stalling the U.S. economy. In 1973 to 74, we have the OPEC oil embargo on U.S., and prices are steadily rising from the 70s. Gallons of gasoline are going up from 40 cents to $1.20, which sounds nice to us now, right? But you have to think about inflation, obviously, price of the dollar, and all that sort of stuff as well. We have issues with the U.S. auto industry. We're seeing a loss of reputation in some auto industries in the U.S. We're seeing some people, now I know that some of you guys who are big classic U.S. cars might not agree with this statement, but many people are saying that Japanese car companies are vastly expanding their sales in the U.S. because a lot of people see them as better built or more fuel efficient or cheaper. And then in 1979, we have the Iranian Revolution, which leads to a second oil crisis of the 1970s. There's just not really many breaks being caught, right, during this decade, especially when we look at how energy is playing a role. And as we talked about before, that is one of the biggest kind of issues when we look back at Carter's legacy is how the energy crisis is handled. We also have the me generation. The me generations. This is a different thing. It's shifting away from some of the more political stuff, and we're going to look at culture, and then we'll see how culture then in turn affects politics in just a little bit. In the 1960s, there is this idea of radicals challenging many of society's traditional beliefs and values. The me generation is the United States generation, which is often referring to the baby boomer generation and the self-involved qualities that some people associated with it. Now, the people who raised these people were basically growing up in like a Great Depression. Okay, so when you come around and you have a difference in values and you have people who see things in the world a different way, you're going to get some backlash and some pushback. There's also some different changes here that we're seeing, radicals challenging ideas of gender norms and youth culture. The 1960s are remembered as a time of political protests, radical experimentation with new cultural experiences, things like the sexual revolution, mainstream awareness of Eastern religions, and all sorts of other things. The civil rights movement gave rebellious young people serious goals to work towards, and on top of that, cultural experimentation was justified as being directed towards spiritual or intellectual enlightenment. The 70s, however, in contrast, were a time of disillusionment and idealistic politics among the young, particularly after the resignation of Richard Nixon and the end of the Vietnam War. By the end of the 1970s, behaviors became more common. These behaviors including things like, this huge kind of obsession with the idea of self-improvement, self-help books, health and exercise fads, new age spirituality, discos and hot tub parties. Sounds kind of fun, right? the growth of the self-help book industry becoming identified with the baby boomers during the 1970s, the marketing of lifestyle products, eagerly consumed by baby boomers with disposable income during the 1970s, became an inescapable part of their culture. Revlon's marketing staff did research into young women's cultural values during the 1970s, revealing that young women were striving to compete with men in the workplace and to express themselves as independent individuals. Now, a lot of people, especially in the conservative party, are looking at this and they're saying, hey, this isn't quite for us. This is something that's challenging traditional beliefs. And so what happens next is that the conservative party reasserts traditional values. You start to see a resurgence of fundamental Christianity. We're seeing what is known as another Great Awakening. We have the number of people that belong to evangelical churches rising rapidly. And then more importantly than a lot of this stuff, the media is now using things like television to gain a broader audience. So you have people like televangelists, TV preachers, right? Previously, you'd have to go, you could maybe listen on the radio, but you'd have to go to like a church, right? Now, you can have church in your living room, right? And then on top of that, we have guys like Jerry Falwell, Oral Roberts. Shout out to Oral Roberts in the NCAA tournament. That's where the name comes from, if you were wondering. And then more contemporarily, this is something that we still see with people like Joel Osteen. 1980 comes around, and Ronald Reagan is now going to use his alliance with those conservative values and the conservative party to help win the White House after losing in 1976. So he loses in 76. He comes back, a familiar face. People are not broadly loving everything involving counterculture, involving the me generation. And so they use this idea of traditional values to champion their way into another presidency. And that is what we have for the day in regards to notes. Next class, when we come together, we will talk about some stuff that is happening more towards we'll finish off with Carter, and we'll move towards some stuff that is happening in like Iran and some more stuff with Camp David and some more hostage crisis situations. All right. So that is all I have for today as far as notes go. The rest of the class period you guys should use for yourself.